The air over German bases in October of 1943 smelled of high-octane fuel and victory. Returning Luftwaffe pilots, brimming with the predatory arrogance of the master hunter, watched as their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were rearmed and refueled. They had just taught the Americans a lesson in the unforgiving mathematics of air combat over Schweinfurt. A decorated major, his Knight's Cross glinting at his throat, gestured towards the west with his leather glove. He recounted how the lumbering American flying fortresses fell from the sky like swatted flies, their defensive formations shattered by disciplined head-on attacks. He would explain to the younger pilots that the Americans simply did not understand. They believed a war could be won with production lines, with sheer mass. It was the thinking of a nation that built excellent refrigerators and razor blades. But the sky, he insisted, was not a factory floor. It was an arena for warriors, for an elite brotherhood of aces who had mastered their craft in the skies over Spain, Poland, France, and Britain. They build formations, but we build warriors. They do not understand the sky, and for that, they will continue to burn. This was not the empty bluster of propaganda. The Luftwaffe's self-assurance was a weapon forged in the crucible of 5 years of relentless warfare. From the Condor Legion's proving grounds in Spain to the swift subjugation of Poland and France, German air power had been the gleaming tip of the Wehrmacht's spear. Their commanders had written the modern textbook on tactical air support, and their pilots, the Experten, were the undisputed masters of their craft, many with kill counts soaring into the hundreds. They had faced the best of the Royal Air Force and the Soviet Air Force and had prevailed through superior tactics, training, and a warrior ethos that bordered on a knightly order. This mastery found its ultimate expression in the defense of the Reich. Against the American 8th Air Force, the Jagdwaffe developed a doctrine of chilling lethality. They did not simply throw fighters at the bomber streams, they orchestrated a multi-layered, calculated slaughter. They tracked the formations with advanced radar, vectored their twin-engine heavy fighters to attack from the rear with rockets and cannons to break up the formations, and then unleashed their single-engine Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in devastating head-on passes. This terrifying tactic, the Stirnenflug, required nerves of steel, as German pilots flew directly into the massed machine gun fire of the bombers, but it exploited the B-17's principal vulnerability and was brutally effective. The raid on the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants on October 14, 1943, a day the Americans would forever call Black Thursday, was the crowning validation of this doctrine. It was not a battle, it was an execution. 60 American heavy bombers were blasted from the sky. Over 600 highly trained airmen were lost in a single afternoon. To the German High Command, this was the final, irrefutable proof. Their system worked. Their analysis was correct. American industrial might was useless if its aerial platforms could be systematically annihilated long before reaching their targets. Thus, the Luftwaffe became a victim of its own success. They were not complacent fools. They were brilliant, experienced professionals trapped within a paradigm that had proven flawless. Their entire strategic calculation was based on the premise that the American bomber would always be the primary target, and the American fighter would always be a short-leashed bodyguard. They had perfected the answer to a specific question, never imagining that their enemy was about to change the question entirely. In the meticulously organized offices of the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch, the war was a problem of physics and arithmetic. Analysts laid out reports on American fighter capabilities with the detached precision of engineers. The primary American escort, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, was a known quantity. It was a rugged, powerful beast, heavily armed and capable of absorbing immense punishment. But its Achilles heel was its thirst. Its effective combat radius, even with external drop tanks, barely stretched to 350 miles. This created a stark line on the map of the Reich, a perimeter beyond which the American bombers flew alone and vulnerable. The other main escort, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, possessed greater range, but German pilots had quickly discovered its weaknesses. The fork-tailed Devil was less maneuverable, and its engines were notoriously problematic in the cold, thin air of high altitudes where the crucial battles were fought. German engineers, the finest in the world, examined the problem from first principles. To them, a high-performance long-range fighter was a contradiction in terms. Every additional gallon of fuel was a penalty paid in weight, climb rate, and agility. Any aircraft capable of flying from England to Berlin and back would be so laden with fuel it would handle like a transport plane, becoming easy prey for their nimble B-109 interceptors waiting near the target. The Americans, they concluded, were caught in an unsolvable technical dilemma. But the most compelling data came from the casualty ledgers. The numbers from Black Thursday were not just a victory, they were a mathematical proof, a loss rate exceeding 25%. Even if the Americans managed to sustain a 10% attrition rate, the operational life of a bomber crew was statistically fewer than 10 missions. No organization, military or otherwise, could sustain such hemorrhaging of its most skilled personnel and expensive equipment. The German General Staff calculated that the 8th Air Force would break long before the German war machine did. They were feeding their youth into a furnace, and the German fighter arm was that furnace. The logic was cold, brutal, and seemingly irrefutable. The American strategic bombing campaign was committing suicide. The conclusion, therefore, was not merely an operational assessment. It was a gleaming fortress of logic built upon the unyielding foundations of physics, experience, and the enemy's own repeated failures. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, who had once famously declared that the German people could call him Meyer if an enemy bomber ever reached the Ruhr, saw the wreckage of Black Thursday as the ultimate vindication. The Americans could darken the skies over the French coast, but the sacred airspace over the German heartland was and would remain inviolable. Their strategy was fundamentally flawed, a brutish misapplication of industrial power against the finesse of German airmanship. This belief was codified in the formal reports sent to the highest levels of the Reich. The operational analysis was clear. Deep penetration, unescorted daylight bombing is suicide. Deep penetration escorted bombing is a technical fantasy. A senior planner for the Luftwaffe summarized the consensus in a now infamous memorandum. The enemy is bound by the same unforgiving laws of aeronautical science as we are. To believe they can produce a fighter that can fly a 1,000-mile round trip, retain enough fuel for an hour of high-intensity combat, and still outperform our short-range interceptors is to believe in a fairy tale. The matter was settled. It was impossible. But while the German High Command was congratulating itself on the perfection of its defensive fortress, a revolution was quietly unfolding across the English Channel. Their impeccable logic, their sound engineering principles, and their battle-hardened experience were all based on analyzing an enemy that, in a matter of weeks, would cease to exist. What the German analysts, in their clinical dissection of P-47 fuel consumption, did not know was that the Fairytale machine they had dismissed as impossible was already rolling off assembly lines in California and Texas by the thousand. It was called the P-51 Mustang. It was an aircraft born of a British need and an American production miracle, a sublime fusion of a brilliant American airframe with the legendary British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This was the variable that shattered their entire equation. With its laminar flow wings and immense internal fuel capacity, augmented by external drop tanks, the Mustang could not only fly to Berlin and back, but it could arrive over the target with enough fuel and performance to dogfight for 30 minutes before turning for home. What was once the Luftwaffe's secure backyard was about to become the Americans' primary hunting ground, and a new hunter had just arrived to lead the pack. In January of 1944, command of the 8th Air Force passed to General James Jimmy Doolittle. He was not a strategist of attrition, he was an aviator of aggression, the man who had led the audacious raid on Tokyo. He looked at the staggering bomber losses not as a reason for caution, but as proof that a defensive mindset was a fatal disease. He understood that the only way to protect his fat friends, the bombers, was not to cower beside them, but to seek out and exterminate the wolves. The very definition of the word escort was about to be rewritten in fire and steel, thousands of feet above the Reich. The German High Command viewed air combat as a contest of champions, a modern-day jousting tournament between elite experten. Their entire doctrine was built on the perfection of the individual pilot and the surgical application of tactical finesse. It was a philosophy of the rapier. The emerging American worldview, however, was that of the sledgehammer. It treated warfare not as a duel, but as a problem of industrial output and attrition. If the enemy was a wall, you did not seek the weakest brick. You simply built a machine that could pulverize the entire structure. This was not a clash of technologies. but a collision of two fundamentally different civilizations. For months, the Americans had fought the war on German terms. The doctrine of close escort was a logical but fatally flawed concept. It turned their powerful fighters into tethered guard dogs forced to fly at the slow speed of the bombers, their energies consumed by defensive weaving. This handed the tactical initiative entirely to the Luftwaffe. The Germans chose the time and place of every engagement, assembling their storm groups at leisure and striking with calculated precision, knowing the American escorts could not pursue them without abandoning their flock. It was a reactive, defensive posture, and it was getting American crews killed by the thousand. Into this equation, Jimmy Doolittle dropped a philosophical bomb. His new directive, issued in early 1944, was a masterpiece of brutal simplicity. As one pilot would later summarize it, the order was, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." This short sentence completely inverted the logic of the air war. The fighters were unleashed. They were no longer shepherds, they were wolves. Their mission was not to cling to the bombers, but to roam far ahead of them, to sweep into German airspace and hunt the Jagdwaffe to extinction. Suddenly, the bombers were no longer the mission. They were the bait. Doolittle knew the Luftwaffe had to rise and fight to defend its factories and cities. And when they did, they would not find predictable escort patterns. They would find swarms of P-51s waiting for them as they assembled, pouncing on them as they refueled, and chasing them all the way back to their airfields. Men like Colonel Don Blakesley, who had been chafing under the restraints of close escort for months, were now given official sanction for the aggression they had always craved. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a superior aircraft. It was the physical embodiment of this new predatory philosophy, the tool that allowed the hunters to be set free. The Germans were meticulously calculating the attrition rates for bombers, while the Americans had just changed the target of attrition to the German pilot himself. The atmosphere in the main briefing room at 8th Air Force Headquarters, codenamed Pine Tree, was thick with the cold dread of statistics. The maps lining the walls were scarred with red lines tracing the routes to places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, routes that had become one-way trips for hundreds of aircrews. The men gathered there, group commanders, operations officers, veterans of the bomber offensive, were tired of eulogies. Into this somber room stepped General Jimmy Doolittle, the new commander, his presence radiating an impatient energy that cut through the gloom. He wasted no time with pleasantries. He stood before the main map of Germany and pointed to the heart of the Reich. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but hard as flint, "our losses are unacceptable. We are fighting a defensive war, and we are losing it." He let that statement hang in the air. "We have been trying to parry the Luftwaffe's attacks as they come. We have failed." Then came the words that would change the course of the war in the air. Effective immediately, the paradigm has shifted. The first duty of our fighters is no longer to bring the bombers back. Their first duty is to destroy the German Air Force. A stunned silence filled the room, broken by the sharp protest of a veteran bomber wing commander. "General, with all due respect, that's suicide. You're telling us you're going to release the escorts. Let them go chasing bandits while our boys fly into the flak zones alone. We'll be massacred." This was the voice of the old guard, of men who had seen their crews ripped apart and who instinctively clung to the idea of the little friends as their only shield. To them, Doolittle's plan sounded like a death sentence, a strategic abandonment. Doolittle turned to face the skeptical commander, his gaze unwavering. "No," he countered, "you will not be alone. You will be flying through a sky that we have sanitized. We have been trying to protect the flock by staying close to it. Instead, we are going to kill the wolves before they ever leave their dens. The bombers are no longer just a weapon. They are the bait that will draw the Luftwaffe to its own destruction." In that moment, the debate was over. The fighter commanders in the room, men like Don Blakesley, looked as though they had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. The bomber men were apprehensive. The greatest, most violent gamble of the air war had just been set in motion. On the 20th of February 1944, the teletypes in Luftwaffe command centers began to chatter with a familiar urgency. A massive American raid was forming up, a steel river of over 1,000 heavy bombers, its target the vital aircraft production centers deep inside Germany. Veteran controllers and fighter leaders initiated the well-rehearsed choreography of interception. This was the moment they were masters of. Storm groups of heavily armed Focke-Wulfs were ordered to assemble, while squadrons of high-altitude Messerschmitts prepared to climb and provide top cover. It was to be Schweinfurt all over again, but on an even grander scale. As the German formations began their laborious climb to combat altitude, the first anomaly appeared. The American escorts were not where they were supposed to be. They were not clinging protectively to the flanks of the bomber stream. Instead, reports began to flood the command posts from spotters and forward airfields. Enemy fighters in vast numbers were already over German territory, roaming far ahead of the main force. They were not flying a defensive weave, they were prowling, hunting. The German pilots, ascending to set their trap, were suddenly discovering that a trap had already been set for them. The first contact was a scene of utter chaos. A German Staffel of Bf-109s, still maneuvering to gain a height advantage, was suddenly swarmed by silver-nosed fighters that dove on them out of the sun. These were not the ponderous thunderbolts the Germans were used to fighting on their own terms. These new aircraft were sleek, fast, and handled with a shocking agility at high altitude. The meticulously planned German attack, designed to be a single coordinated blow against the bombers, was shattered into 100 desperate individual dogfights before it could even begin. German pilots found themselves fighting not for a strategic objective, but for their very lives, miles away from the bombers they were supposed to be attacking. Those who made it back to base were shaken. Their debriefings were a confused litany of shock and disbelief. They spoke of being ambushed, of being outnumbered, of American fighters that appeared from nowhere and refused to let go, hounding them right down to the treetops. The kill claims against the bombers were far lower than expected, while the tally of their own losses was alarmingly high. The numbers filtering up to the high command painted a disturbing picture, a stark reversal of the Schweinfurt statistics. The operation, which the Americans would call the Big Week, had begun. The German defensive system had not broken, not yet. But on that first day, a deep, resonant crack had appeared in the fortress wall of its confidence. The perfect, lethal machine of the Jagdwaffe had been met, and for the first time, it had been thrown completely off balance. The enemy was no longer playing by the rules. An Oberleutnant of Jagdgeschwader II, a veteran of 50 combat missions, scanned the winter sky from the cockpit of his Messerschmitt. Below him, the bomber stream was a distant metallic river. His mind was a cold instrument of calculation, running through the familiar steps of the attack: gain altitude, coordinate with the storm group, then roll into the head-on pass that would shatter the lead bomber formation. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the supreme confidence of a predator about to strike a predictable and lumbering prey. He knew the enemy's playbook by heart, but the playbook was gone. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was the radio, which erupted not with the clipped commands of the attack controller, but with a chaotic torrent of warnings. Bandits high. At 6 o'clock. They are above us. The Oberleutnant snapped his head back and felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was true. High above, catching the sun's glare, were dozens, perhaps hundreds of enemy fighters. They were not where they were supposed to be. They were not defensively tethered to the bombers. They were circling like vultures, holding the ultimate tactical advantage of height, waiting. The sky became a maelstrom of silver sharks. A squadron of P-51s fell upon his Staffel with a ferocity he had never witnessed. He broke hard, pushing his Bf-109 into a screaming dive, expecting the heavier American fighter to overshoot. But this new machine was different. It stuck to his tail like a coat of paint, matching his every maneuver. In his earphones, he heard the panicked cry of his wingman, a cry that was abruptly cut off by the percussive thump of cannon shells hitting his own airframe. He saw another Messerschmitt to his left simply disintegrate in a flash of orange and black smoke. For the first time in his career, the Oberleutnant was not hunting. He was prey. The structured, almost balletic violence of the head-on pass was replaced by a desperate, frantic scramble for survival. The Americans were not just defending their bombers, they were on a mission of extermination. He managed to escape only by diving into a thick cloud bank, his aircraft riddled with holes, his nerves shattered. When he landed, the scene at his base was one of grim confusion. Pilots emerged from their cockpits pale and shaken, speaking in hushed, incredulous tones. They spoke of a sky that had been stolen from them. The reports that flowed from the Frontline squadrons that evening were a testament to a profound psychological shock. They were filled with words that had rarely featured in the lexicon of the triumphant Luftwaffe: ambushed, overwhelmed, hunted from above. They described an enemy who fought with a savage, unrestrained aggression. The pilots, the very men who had been the confident masters of their domain just that morning, were now staring into a new and terrifying reality. They had flown out to execute a well-oiled plan and had instead flown into the teeth of a buzzsaw. The stunned reports from the front lines were soon reinforced by a tidal wave of cold, hard arithmetic that crashed against the desks of the German High Command. The shock the pilots felt in the sky was merely the emotional symptom of a deeper industrial disease. In the single year of 1944, the United States would produce over 96,000 military aircraft. Germany, with its entire economy strained to the breaking point, would manage to build approximately 40,000. The Americans were not just waging a war, they were burying the Reich under an avalanche of aluminum and steel, and the P-51 Mustang was the tip of that avalanche. The technical specifications of this one aircraft rendered Germany's entire defensive map obsolete. The combat radius of a Messerschmitt Bf-109 was roughly 350 miles, a leash that tied it to the German heartland. The North American P-51D, with its drop tanks, boasted a combat range of 1,650 miles. This was not an incremental improvement. It was an evolutionary leap that turned the deepest sanctuaries of the Reich into a frontline combat zone. The impossibility that German engineers had so confidently dismissed was now a statistical and operational reality, patrolling the skies over Berlin. But the most terrifying numbers were written in blood. During that single, week-long operation in late February, the Big Week, the American 8th Air Force lost 247 heavy bombers and 33 fighters. These were grievous losses, but sustainable for an industrial giant. The Luftwaffe, in exchange, lost 355 fighters. And here was the fatal statistic, the one that stopped the hearts of German planners. 191 German fighter pilots were killed or reported missing. These were not rookie trainees. They were seasoned veterans, the products of years of training and combat. And in 1 week, a significant portion of that priceless human capital was erased from the board. This was not a temporary setback. It was the beginning of a systematic annihilation. In the first 4 months of 1944, from January to the end of April, the German day fighter force lost over 1,000 pilots, killed, captured, or gravely wounded. This was more than a bleeding of manpower. It was a catastrophic bleeding of irreplaceable experience. The core of veteran aces, the legendary Expert 10, who had been the foundation of the Luftwaffe's superiority since 1939, was being systematically hunted and wiped out. The war of attrition had been turned on its head. The Americans were now targeting not just factories, but the very soul of the German fighter arm. No single event better captured the raw, aggressive spirit of this new doctrine than the unofficial mutiny of Colonel Don Blakesley and the 4th Fighter Group. The 4th was an elite unit, composed largely of American volunteers who had flown with the Royal Air Force in the Eagle squadrons before America entered the war. They were seasoned, cocky, and utterly lethal. And under the command of the outspoken Blakesley, they chafed under the stifling doctrine of close escort more than anyone. To Blakesley, a wolf forced to walk at a sheep's pace, forcing his pilots to fly lazy circles around bombers, while the enemy dictated the terms of battle, was a criminal waste of talent and machinery. On a mission before Doolittle's official order changed the rules, Blakesley's group performed their duty flawlessly. They met a determined attack by German fighters, broke it up, and sent the surviving Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs fleeing for the safety of their bases below. Under the old rules, this was victory. The fighters were to reform on the bombers and continue their watch. But for Blakesley, watching the enemy escape to fight another day was an intolerable offense against logic. He keyed his radio, his voice crackling across the command frequency. He requested permission from his superior to take his group down to the deck to strafe the German airfield where the enemy fighters were landing. The reply was a sharp, unequivocal negative. The mission was to protect the bombers, period. Stay with the fat friends. Any other commander would have complied. But Don Blakesley was not any other commander. What happened next became the stuff of legend, a moment that perfectly symbolized the revolution to come. Blakesley keyed his microphone again, but instead of acknowledging the order, he broadcast a stream of feigned radio interference. "Say again, you're breaking up. I can't read you." Then, turning to his own pilots, he gave the order they had been dreaming of for months. "Follow me." With that, he rolled his P-51 over and led the entire 4th Fighter Group in a screaming power dive, abandoning the bombers and plunging towards the German airfield below. The scene on the ground was one of complete panic and disbelief. German ground crews, accustomed to the safety of their own bases, suddenly saw dozens of American fighters roaring towards them at treetop level. The air was filled with the savage chatter of 50 caliber machine guns as Blakesley's pilots ripped through parked aircraft, fuel trucks, and anything that moved. In a matter of minutes, they turned a secure rear area base into a blazing inferno, inflicting more damage on the Luftwaffe in 5 minutes on the ground than they could have in an hour of dogfighting in the air. This single act of glorious insubordination was more than just a successful raid. It was a prophecy. It was the physical manifestation of the Doolittle Doctrine, executed by men who understood its truth in their bones before it was ever formalized as a command. It proved that the weapon of American industrial might was useless without the untamable predatory spirit of the hunter. The Germans had prepared for machines and formations. They had no defense against the indomitable will of men like Don Blakesley. The collision in the skies over Germany was more than a battle between aircraft. It was a war between two incompatible philosophies, two industrial religions. The German approach to air power was that of a master watchmaker, precise, intricate, and deeply rooted in the idea of artisanal perfection. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the ultimate expression of this creed, a lightweight, complex, high-performance machine, a dueling rapier honed to a razor's edge for a very specific task, short-range interception. It was a weapon to be wielded by an experte, a master craftsman of combat whose individual skill was the centerpiece of the entire system. The American system, embodied by the P-51, was the product of the Foundry, not the watchmaker's bench. It was a philosophy of overwhelming force, of rugged simplicity and mass production. The Mustang was a brilliant aircraft, but its true genius lay not in delicate complexity, but in its strategic reach and its suitability for the assembly line. The American pilot was not expected to be a legendary virtuoso with 200 kills. He was the product of a vast training pipeline that stretched from the clear skies of Arizona to the muddy fields of England, a competent, aggressive, and most importantly, endlessly replaceable component in a giant machine. The Germans cultivated aces, the Americans manufactured an air force. This philosophical chasm was starkly visible on the ground. A German crew chief, forged in a culture of scarcity, would labor for days to repair a damaged engine, carefully salvaging every piston and wire. The loss of a single aircraft was a significant blow. His American counterpart at a base in England, faced with a similarly damaged Mustang, would simply call for a forklift. The entire engine assembly would be unbolted, hoisted out, and a brand new Merlin engine, fresh from a crate shipped from Detroit, would be dropped into its place. The damaged unit wasn't repaired, it was replaced. One system was designed to conserve, the other was built to expend. In the air, these opposing worldviews met in a final brutal reckoning. The Luftwaffe responded to the American challenge by creating ever larger, more heavily armed battle formations, the Gefechtsverbände, rigid, unwieldy phalanxes of battering ram fighters escorted by high-altitude cover. It was a tactic of immense power, but complete predictability. The Americans met this armored fist not with a shield, but with a swarm. Their fighters flew in fluid, four-plane elements, decentralized and empowered to hunt. While the Germans were trying to orchestrate a single, decisive blow, hundreds of American pilots were engaged in a chaotic Darwinian free-for-all, seeking targets of opportunity and overwhelming the rigid German formations with aggression from every direction. It was the watchmaker's perfect, intricate gear train being systematically shattered by the relentless pounding of 1,000 hammers. The true psychological weapon that broke the Jagdwaffe was not the P-51 itself, but its sheer profligate ubiquity. A German pilot rising to intercept a bomber stream in the spring of 1944 no longer faced a manageable screen of escorts. He faced a sky filled with enemies. There were fighters above him, fighters level with him, and fighters below him. The Americans seemed to conjure aircraft out of thin air, an endless conveyor belt that stretched from factories in California to the cloud-filled skies over Brunswick. For every German fighter that took off, it seemed 10 American fighters were waiting. This numerical supremacy led the Americans to adopt tactics that, to the resource-conscious German mind, bordered on insanity. The most shocking of these was the widespread use of high-performance fighters for ground strafing. After unleashing their fighters, Doolittle's pilots would escort the bombers to the target, engage the Luftwaffe, and then, on the way home, they were free to descend to treetop level and expend their remaining ammunition on targets of opportunity. A P-51 Mustang, a complex, expensive, state-of-the-art air superiority fighter, was used to attack locomotives, staff cars, barges on canals, and even German soldiers riding bicycles. To a German commander, this was strategic madness. To risk a priceless pilot and his thoroughbred machine to destroy a single truck was an act of unthinkable wastefulness. Their entire military culture was based on the careful preservation of elite assets. But they were projecting their own scarcity onto an enemy who operated by a completely different logic. The Americans had done the brutal math. A fighter plane was an expendable munition. If a $500,000 P-51 could be traded for a locomotive that was essential to supplying a panzer division at the front, it was a profitable exchange. This weapon of abundance had a devastating effect on morale. It was one thing to be shot down in a noble dogfight against a worthy opponent. It was another thing entirely to survive that dogfight, nurse your damaged aircraft back towards your home base, only to be ambushed and killed by a roving pack of American fighters who were hunting you over your own airfield. There were no more safe havens. The war was everywhere. This horrifying omnipresence communicated a single, soul-crushing message to every German soldier, pilot, and general. You cannot win. You are not fighting an army. You are fighting a factory. You are not losing a battle. You are being drowned by an industrial tsunami. The sight of American fighters strafing a field of cows because there was nothing else left to shoot at was more demoralizing than losing a dozen aircraft over Berlin. It was a contemptuous display of inexhaustible power, a final, brutal audit of two competing systems in which the balance sheet was written in blood and aluminum. At first, the reports were dismissed as battlefield hysteria. A trickle of alarming dispatches from frontline airfields in late February of 1944 was met with skepticism and irritation in the opulent headquarters of the Reichsmarschall. Hermann Göring and his staff, still basking in the afterglow of the Schweinfurt victories, saw the initial accounts of vast swarms of new American fighters as the predictable exaggerations of young, unnerved pilots. An official in the operations room might have noted a statistical anomaly, a bad day, but the institutional arrogance was a shield against the horrifying truth the numbers contained. But the trickle soon became a flood, and the flood became a deluge. The bad day stretched into a week, and the week bled into a month of catastrophic losses. Staff officers, whose job was to turn chaos into cold data, watched in horror as the trend lines on their charts inverted. The kill-to-loss ratios, once a source of immense pride, were now plummeting into deficit. Maps of the Reich, once neatly bisected by the line of the P-47's range, were now covered in a rash of sightings of the new American fighter. They were over Brunswick, over Leipzig, and then, the ultimate violation, over Berlin itself. The abstract reports from the front had solidified into an undeniable, terrifying geographic reality. The sanctuary was no more. The crisis came to a head in a series of tense, smoke-filled briefings. General Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, stood before Göring and the Luftwaffe's senior leadership. He was a man who lived by facts, and the facts he presented were the statistical death sentence of the Jagdwaffe. With grim precision, he laid out the charts showing the loss of nearly 1,000 pilots in just the first 4 months of the year. He was not merely reporting the loss of machines, which were replaceable. He was reporting the extinction of the Experten, the irreplaceable soul of his fighting force. Reichsmarschall, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, the Americans have changed the very nature of the war. Their fighters are no longer leashed to the bombers. They have been unleashed to hunt us. We are being bled white. Göring's reaction was a volcanic eruption of denial and fury. He could not, or would not, grasp the strategic revolution Galland was describing. To accept it would be to admit his own boasts were hollow, his entire defensive strategy a failure. And so, he lashed out at the only target his ego would allow, his own men. He accused the fighter pilots of cowardice, of lacking the aggressive spirit of their forefathers. He bellowed that if he gave his pilots the finest aircraft in the world, they still found excuses to fail. He was a commander consuming his own legend, unable to process a reality that contradicted his carefully constructed myth of invincibility. When the shouting finally subsided, a cold, heavy silence settled over the room. The truth, once spoken, could not be unsaid. The alarm was no longer a distant bell from the front lines. It was now a screaming siren within the walls of the High Command itself. The men in that room, the architects of the world's most feared air force, were forced to confront a reality they had deemed impossible. They had built a perfect shield against a battering ram, only to find the enemy had seeped through the walls like a poison gas, attacking the very heart of their institution. The game had changed, and they were catastrophically behind. When the final Götterdämmerung consumed the Third Reich, the time for boasts and bluster was over. In the cold, sterile interrogation rooms of Allied intelligence and in the quiet reflection of post-war memoirs, the final, unvarnished truth emerged from the very men who had once personified the Luftwaffe's arrogant confidence. Stripped of their medals and their authority, they were forced to conduct the autopsy on their own colossal failure, and their testimony was more damning than any Allied report. General Adolf Galland, the consummate professional, provided the clinical analysis. As a captive, he explained the strategic shift with the dispassionate clarity of a master swordsman describing the single fatal thrust that had defeated him. In his memoirs, he wrote the definitive epitaph for his own command. The fateful decision which doomed the German fighter force, he stated, was the decision of the Americans to release their fighters from the shackles of close escort. They let them go hunting, and they hunted us to death. There was no excuse, no mitigation. It was a simple, brutal admission that the enemy had found the perfect counter, a strategic key for which the Luftwaffe had no lock. But the most potent confession came from the architect of the disaster himself, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. The flamboyant paladin, the man who had promised the German people that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Reich, was now a bloated, defeated figure facing his accusers at Nuremberg. When asked by an interrogator to pinpoint the moment he knew the air war was lost, his response was not a complex strategic analysis. It was a cry of pure psychological surrender, an admission that the impossible had come to pass. His voice, stripped of its customary bombast, was flat with the weight of absolute defeat. When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, he admitted, I knew the jig was up. That single sentence was the ultimate capitulation. It was the sound of a myth shattering. The Mustang over Berlin was not just an aircraft. It was the physical embodiment of a broken promise and a failed ideology. It was the symbol of an enemy who could not only build refrigerators and razor blades, but who could build a weapon that could reach into the very heart of the Reich and tear it out. These were more than just the words of defeated men. They were the final verdict in the great philosophical contest that had been waged at 30,000 feet. Galland's cold analysis and Göring's visceral admission were two sides of the same coin of truth. The German belief in the supremacy of the elite warrior, the Experte, had been decisively and brutally rendered obsolete. The age of the duelist was over. The age of the industrial swarm had begun. Faced with this existential threat, the German High Command did what it had always done. It turned to its engineers and tacticians to innovate a solution. They were not a people to surrender to an enemy's new weapon. They would counter it, best it, and reassert their dominance. But in their frantic search for a response, they revealed their fatal flaw. They tried to solve a problem of quantity with ever more desperate applications of quality, trapped within the very mindset that was leading them to ruin. Their first response was tactical. If the American fighters were now the primary threat, they would build a formation that could punch through them. This gave birth to the Gefechtsverband, a massive battle formation with heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190 Sturmbocke, or battering rams, at its core. These planes were flying fortresses, laden with extra armor plating and armed with devastating 30mm cannons designed to obliterate a bomber with a single hit. It was a vision of Teutonic knights charging into battle. But this armored fist was slow and clumsy. To protect these bomber killers from the swarms of P-51s, they required their own escort of high-altitude Bf-109s. The result was a baroque, unwieldy structure, a formation designed to protect bombers that now needed its own protectors. It was a tactician's nightmare, a massive, slow-moving target that the fluid, decentralized American fighter groups could dissect at will. The second response was technological, the Reich's last great hope, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. It was a machine from the future, an aircraft so revolutionary that it could slice through the American formations with impunity, its speed making it virtually untouchable by piston-engine fighters. To the German pilots who flew it, it was a miracle, a silver shark in a sky of minnows. But a miracle in the laboratory is not a weapon in the field. The Me-262 was plagued by unreliable engines, required specially trained pilots who were in critically short supply, and consumed vast quantities of fuel that Germany no longer had. Worse, its production was hampered by Allied bombing and Hitler's insane insistence that it be developed as a Blitz bomber. It was the ultimate expression of the German philosophy, a sublime, world-beating piece of technology that arrived far too late and in far too few numbers to have any strategic effect. But the most tragic failure was human. As the veteran Experten were systematically hunted down and killed, the Luftwaffe was forced to throw hastily trained teenagers into the cockpits of its most advanced fighters. These young pilots, with barely 100 hours of flying time, were sent up against American veterans with 10 times their experience. They were not warriors. They were sacrifices. They were trying to replenish a dwindling stock of master craftsmen with apprentices, while the Americans were simply rolling out an endless supply of factory-trained workers. Each German countermeasure was a reflection of their own tragic misunderstanding of the war they were now fighting. They built stronger swords, while the Americans were destroying their swordsmen. They forged a handful of miracle weapons, while the Americans overwhelmed them with a flood of merely excellent ones. They were trying to win a decisive duel, blind to the fact that they were no longer in a duel. They were in a siege, and the walls were collapsing all around them. The greatest casualties of the new American air strategy were not tallied in the daily loss reports. The true death was that of an idea, the systematic demolition of the National Socialist myth of the Aryan Superman. For years, the German propaganda machine had portrayed the Luftwaffe pilot as the ultimate expression of this ideal, a modern-day Teutonic knight, a fusion of warrior spirit and technical genius whose natural superiority made him invincible. The Expert, with his staggering kill count, was not just a soldier. He was living proof of a master race. Every victory in the air was a validation of this core ideological belief. The P-51 and the doctrine that unleashed it did not simply defeat this knight, it rendered him obsolete. It introduced a psychological poison into the German system for which there was no antidote. The Americans were not winning through superior chivalry or individual prowess. They were winning through a method the Nazi ideology held in contempt, the relentless, seemingly soulless power of mass production. The German ace, the master craftsman of the ski, was being overwhelmed and killed by men who were portrayed as the products of a decadent, materialistic, and racially mongrel society. This was not just a military defeat, it was a profound ideological contradiction, a humiliation that struck at the very foundations of their worldview. The ultimate symbol of this moral collapse was the sight of a Mustang's silver wings glinting in the sun over Berlin. It was a message broadcast to the entire German nation. It said that your leader's promises are worthless. It said that your technological genius has been surpassed. It said that your sacred homeland is no longer a fortress, but a shooting gallery. For the German pilot, looking up from his own airfield to see the enemy circling freely above, it was a final, soul-crushing confirmation of his own impotence. The sky, his sky, the arena of his supposed racial supremacy, had been conquered and occupied. The P-51 was more than a machine of war. It was an instrument of ideological demolition, and with every strafing run and every victorious dogfight, it shot the myth of the Übermensch full of holes until nothing was left but the bitter truth of defeat. The destruction of the Jagdwaffe in the spring of 1944 was not simply the victory of one air force over another. It was the strategic event that unlocked the final chapter of the Second World War in Europe. Less than 3 months after the Big Week, the largest amphibious invasion in human history began. When Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, they fought against machine guns, artillery, and fortifications. But they did not fight against the Luftwaffe. The skies over the invasion fleet were almost eerily empty of German aircraft. The wolf had been slain months before the lambs were led ashore. Without the air supremacy purchased with the blood of 8th Air Force fighter pilots, D-Day would have been a massacre. This absolute control of the air then became a crushing weight on the German war machine for the remainder of the conflict. The Wehrmacht, once the master of the swift mechanized blitzkrieg, found its panzer divisions paralyzed, its supply columns turned into flaming wreckage, and its troop movements dictated not by its own generals, but by the patrol schedules of Allied fighter bombers. A German soldier's life on the Western Front became a hell of constant fear from above. The strategic air war, a high-altitude contest of eagles, had transformed into a brutal, tactical reality where a single P-47 could terrorize an entire battalion. The war in the sky had determined the outcome of the war on the ground. In the aftermath of the war, the lesson learned over Germany became the foundational doctrine of the new United States Air Force, and by extension, all of modern Western military power. The Doolittle Doctrine was codified into a simple, unshakable principle. Air supremacy is not a supporting objective, it is the absolute precondition for victory. Before a single tank rolls or a single soldier advances, the war in the air must be won, swiftly and decisively. This philosophy drove the design of every major American fighter for the next 75 years. From the F-86 Sabre that swept the skies of MiG Alley in Korea to the F-15 Eagle, a machine built with the sole purpose of achieving total air dominance. The very concept of modern warfare was reshaped. The idea of a no-fly zone, used as a geopolitical tool in conflicts from the Balkans to the Middle East, is a direct political descendant of the strategy solidified over Germany. It is the application of the same brutal lesson. He who controls the sky controls the political and military reality on the ground below. Nations around the world, friend and foe alike, absorbed this truth, pouring their resources into building air forces capable of contesting or dominating their own airspace. Perhaps the most surprising legacy is institutional. The stunning success of the Strategic Air Campaign, culminating in the destruction of the Luftwaffe, provided the final, irrefutable argument for the creation of the United States Air Force as a separate and equal branch of the military in 1947. The world we live in, with its independent air forces and its doctrines of air supremacy, was forged in those desperate, sprawling dogfights in the skies over the Third Reich. The ghost of the defeated Jagdwaffe did not just haunt Germany, its defeat became the blueprint for a new way of war for the entire world. If the epic air battles over the Reich can be distilled into a single lesson, it is this: the nature of power itself had changed. The great contest between the Luftwaffe and the 8th Air Force was not merely a clash of armies or technologies, but of two irreconcilable philosophies. The Germans waged war as an art form, a test of will and spirit, believing in the transcendent power of the elite warrior, the ace, the expert, whose individual genius could overcome any material deficit. It was a magnificent, heroic, and ultimately fatal creed. The Americans, by contrast, came to wage war as an industrial equation to be solved. They learned at a terrible cost that victory in a total global conflict was not about creating a better duelist. It was about creating an unbeatable system, a system of recruitment, training, production, and logistics so vast and so relentless that it could absorb horrific losses and still grind the enemy into dust. This realization leads to a single, brutal aphorism that defined the 20th century and continues to define our own. In the final calculus of modern war, a system designed to mass-produce overwhelming competence will always defeat a culture that worships finite genius. For genius, no matter how brilliant, can be ambushed, exhausted, and killed. A system, however, is a force of nature. It does not bleed, it does not despair. It simply replaces its losses from a reservoir of power so deep that it becomes, in the end, the ultimate arbiter of victory. The Germans sought to forge the perfect sword. The Americans built the unending furnace. Years after the last engine fell silent, when the roar of the Merlin and the Daimler-Benz was just a ghost in the memory, the few surviving German aces would speak of the change. They spoke not of grand strategy, but of a feeling, a sudden, chilling shift in the very character of the sky. What was once their arena, a vast chessboard for knights where skill and nerve were the final arbiters, had become something else entirely. It had become a wilderness filled with an infinite number of predators. A veteran pilot, a man with over 100 victories, once tried to explain it to a young historian. He said it was like being the master hunter in a familiar forest, only to look up one day and realize the forest was now on fire and the trees themselves had grown teeth. He would be asked again and again to name the single cause, the one decision that broke the back of the world's most feared air force. And his answer was always the same, delivered not with bitterness, but with the weary clarity of a man who had stared into the heart of an industrial inferno and survived. He would look past his interviewer to some distant point in the sky and recite the words that had become his truth. "The Americans made a fateful decision," he would say. "They freed their fighters from the shackles of close escort. They let them go hunting, and they hunted us to death." Those last 5 words were the final verdict. They hunted us to death. It was not the epitaph for an air force. It was the epitaph for an entire conception of war, a final, whispered admission from the heart of the storm that the age of the lone eagle was over. From that moment on, the sky would belong not to the finest hunter, but to the largest pack.